The most terrifying discoveries inside Nazi Germany during World War II, secrets hidden in plain sight. It was the winter of 1945, and the war in Europe was almost over. Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Soviets, and others, were pushing deeper into Germany and the lands it had occupied for years. These soldiers had already seen the worst that war could offer. They had crossed frozen rivers, survived bombings, and watched their friends fall beside them. They believed they had seen everything. They were wrong. What waited for them on the other side of those final battles was not just a defeated army. What waited for them was the truth, a truth so large, so carefully organized, and so deeply disturbing that many of the men who discovered it could never fully speak about it for the rest of their lives. Some wept. Some stood in silence. Some simply could not believe what their own eyes were showing them. This is the story of what they found. It is a true story. Every detail in it is part of the historical record, confirmed by documents, photographs, survivor testimonies, and official investigations. Nothing has been added or changed. The truth, on its own, is more powerful than any invented story could ever be. It begins not with a dramatic discovery but with a gate. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers approached a large fenced complex in the southern part of occupied Poland. The place was called Auschwitz. From the outside, it looked like an industrial facility, watchtowers, fences, rows of long buildings stretching into the gray winter sky. The soldiers had heard rumors about places like this. They had dismissed many of those rumors as impossible. Surely, no government could organize something like what people were describing. Surely, it was an exaggeration. Then the gates opened. Inside, they found approximately 7,000 people still alive. That number sounds large until one understands the context. At its peak, this facility had held hundreds of thousands of people at one time. The ones still alive were the ones who had not yet been moved or killed before the soldiers arrived. Many of them could barely stand. Their clothes hung off their bodies. Their faces were hollow. Their eyes were wide and still and very old, regardless of how young they actually were. The soldiers gave them food, blankets, and medicine. And then they walked deeper into the complex. What they found in the storage buildings was one of the most jarring collections of evidence ever assembled in human history. There were 370,000 men's suits, folded and stacked. There were 837,000 women's garments, sorted by size and type. There were hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, including tiny ones that had belonged to children. There were eyeglasses by the thousands, piled in great heaps. There were prosthetic limbs, artificial arms and legs, stacked against the walls. And there was hair. Over 7 tons of human hair, cut from the heads of prisoners and carefully packaged, labeled, and prepared for shipment to German factories where it would be used to make fabric. The soldiers stood in those warehouses and understood something that no military briefing had prepared them for. The people who ran this place had thought of everything. This was not chaos. This was not the result of a frenzied moment of hatred. This was a system. It had been planned on paper, approved by officials, managed by administrators, run by a staff that clocked in and clocked out every day. The scale of what had happened at Auschwitz was almost impossible to grasp. Historians would later calculate that more than 1 million people had been brought to that facility and had not walked back out. They had come from across Europe, from France, from Hungary, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Poland itself, on trains that ran on precise schedules, organized by a transportation department with its own files and forms and employee rosters. One of the most senior Soviet officers to enter the camp sat down on a broken piece of concrete after his first walk through the grounds. A correspondent who was traveling with the unit later wrote that the general, a man who had commanded troops through some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, simply sat there for a very long time without saying a word. There was nothing to say. While Soviet forces were discovering Auschwitz in the east, American forces were encountering something very different in the heart of Germany. In the region of Thuringia, inside a mountain called Kohnstein, engineers and soldiers entered a tunnel system that had been drilled and blasted out of solid rock. The tunnels were wide enough to drive vehicles through. They stretched for over a mile underground. And inside them, neatly laid out along rails and assembly lines, were rockets. The V-2 rocket was one of the most advanced weapons ever built at that time. It flew faster than the speed of sound. It could travel hundreds of miles. It had rained down on London, on Antwerp, on other cities, killing civilians without warning. The people on the ground never heard it coming. The explosion arrived before the sound did. What the Americans found inside that mountain, a facility called the Middlework, was the factory where those rockets had been built. And the story of how they had been built was just as disturbing as the rockets themselves. The Middlework had been constructed and operated by forced laborers, most of them brought from concentration camps. They had been worked in conditions of extreme hardship, with almost no food, no medical care, and no protection from the cold that seeped through the rock walls in winter. They had slept in the tunnels themselves because there was nowhere else to put them. They had carried heavy components, operated dangerous machinery, and assembled rockets that would then be used to harm people in distant cities, people the workers had no reason to want to harm, people just like themselves. The estimated number of people who died building those rockets, from exhaustion, from illness, from deliberate cruelty, is higher than the number of people killed by the rockets when they were fired. The weapons cost more lives to make than they took in use. American intelligence officers who entered the Middlework also found something else, an opportunity. The rocket program had been led by a scientist named Wernher von Braun, who had surrendered to American forces along with a group of other engineers. These men had technical knowledge that the United States very much wanted, particularly with a new kind of competition with the Soviet Union already beginning to form on the horizon. A program called Operation Paperclip was quietly organized. Von Braun and his colleagues were brought to America. Their records were altered or buried. Within years, they were working for the American government, helping to build the rockets that would eventually carry human beings to the moon. The world would debate the morality of that decision for a very long time. Among the most deeply troubling documents recovered after the war were the files kept by a doctor named Joseph Mengele. Mengele was a physician assigned to Auschwitz. He held academic degrees. He had been trained at some of Germany's best universities. And he had taken all of that training, all of that knowledge meant to help human beings, and had applied it to experiments that had nothing to do with medicine as any ethical person would recognize it. Mengele was particularly interested in twins. When the trains arrived at Auschwitz and the passengers were sorted into groups, he would walk the lines looking for twin brothers and sisters, calling out for them, sometimes smiling, sometimes bringing sweets for the children. The twins he selected were separated from the rest of their families and taken to a special block. What happened to them there cannot be described as science. Mengele injected dye into children's eyes, attempting to change their color. He performed operations on people without any pain relief. He infected prisoners with diseases in order to observe the progression. He conducted procedures that served no legitimate medical purpose and caused immense suffering. All of it was carefully documented. The files were organized with the kind of attention to detail that a serious researcher might apply to a genuine study. Case numbers were assigned. Photographs were taken. Observations were written up in neat, professional language. The record-keeping was meticulous. When Allied investigators found these documents, they were confronted with something that forced them to rethink their assumptions about how evil works. They had expected the cruelty to be disorganized, the result of passion or rage or mental illness. Instead, they found calm, careful, systematic documentation. The language in the files was clinical. The handwriting was neat. The procedures had been planned in advance. Mengele himself fled before the camp was liberated. He lived in hiding in South America for decades, dying in Brazil in 1979. He was never captured. He was never tried. The investigators who spent years searching for him eventually closed their files, one by one, without ever finding him in time to face justice. His victims, however, are remembered. Many of the twins who survived him later told their stories publicly, spending decades ensuring that what had been done to them would not be forgotten. They spoke not out of bitterness, though bitterness would have been more than understandable, but out of a belief that the world needed to know. As investigators dug deeper into the records left behind by the Nazi government, they kept encountering the same astonishing fact: almost nothing had been hidden. They expected to find codes, cover up language, euphemisms designed to obscure what had actually been happening. They found some of that. But they also found document after document written in plain, direct language that described exactly what had been done, by whom, where, and on what dates. Among the most striking of these were the reports filed by mobile units that had followed German military forces into the Soviet Union beginning in 1941. These units, known as the Einsatzgruppen, had been given a specific task: to move through conquered territory and eliminate communities deemed enemies of the Reich. The reports they sent back to Berlin described their activities in the same tone one might use to describe a series of business operations. One report noted the elimination of 33,771 people at a location called Babi Yar, outside the city of Kiev, over 2 consecutive days in September 1941. The phrasing was administrative. The numbers were precise. The location was identified. The dates were recorded. Investigators reading these reports at the post-war trials in Nuremberg could barely speak when they were introduced into evidence. Defense attorneys struggled to respond. The documents had been written, signed, and filed by the people who had carried out the operations. No one had forced them to be so thorough. No one had ordered them to be so specific. They had simply gone about their work as though it were entirely normal and had reported on it as they would report on any other assigned task. The courtroom in Nuremberg, which was full of experienced lawyers, judges, journalists, and military officers, fell into a particular kind of silence when those reports were read aloud. It was the silence of people who were being forced to update their understanding of what human beings were capable of. In the Ural Mountains of what is now southwestern Poland, construction workers had been digging since 1943. They were not volunteers. They were forced laborers, and they were digging on a massive scale, cutting tunnels through solid rock, pouring concrete, laying railway tracks, building chambers and corridors and vast underground spaces whose purpose was never fully explained to anyone below the level of senior Nazi leadership. The project was called Riese, which is the German word for giant. And it was, by any measure, a giant undertaking. Millions of cubic meters of rock were removed. Hundreds of thousands of workers were involved over the course of the construction. The infrastructure that was built underground was sophisticated and extensive. When the war ended, the project was abandoned mid-construction. The senior officials who had overseen it were dead, captured, or in hiding. The workers who had built it were scattered or had not survived. And the tunnels were left as they were, incomplete, silent, enormous. Investigators who entered them after the war could see the scale of the ambition but could not determine exactly what the final purpose had been. A command bunker. An armaments factory. A relocation site for top Nazi officials. The evidence pointed in several directions without resolving clearly into one. Decades later, the mystery had still not been fully solved. Historians and researchers continued to study the site. Occasional treasure hunters came with metal detectors and elaborate theories. The Polish government maintained parts of the complex as a memorial and museum, both to honor the memory of those who died there and to preserve the evidence for future study. The Ural Mountains complex stands today as a monument to something strange and sobering, the knowledge that enormous amounts of human suffering can be caused in the name of a project whose ultimate meaning has been lost entirely. There was one more discovery that deserved particular attention, not because it was the largest or the most dramatic, but because of what it revealed about where the machinery of mass destruction had actually begun. Before the concentration camps. Before the gas chambers. Before the vast, continent-wide systems of transportation and elimination that the Nazi government had built, there was a small administrative office at an address in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. It was from this office that a program called T4 was organized and managed. The T4 program began in 1939, before the war had even fully begun. Its targets were not enemies of a foreign country. Its targets were German citizens, specifically, German citizens who had physical disabilities, mental illness, or intellectual challenges. The ideology behind the program held that these individuals were not contributing to society and that their existence was, in the language of the program, life unworthy of life. Doctors and nurses were recruited. Institutions were identified. Patients were transferred to facilities where they were killed, initially by injection, and later in sealed chambers using gas. The families of those who were taken received letters explaining that their loved ones had died of natural causes. Death certificates were falsified. Bodies were cremated before families could request independent examinations. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people were killed under the T4 program. What investigators found afterward, the forms, the medical records, the falsified letters, the correspondence between administrators, revealed something that took a long time to fully absorb: the system of organized, large-scale elimination that the world had been horrified to discover in the concentration camps had first been developed, tested, and refined in hospitals and care facilities across Germany, under the supervision of trained medical professionals, and the victims had been German citizens. In peacetime, years before the war had given anyone an excuse to abandon their moral standards. The beginning had not been foreign. The beginning had been domestic. The machinery had been built at home, on ordinary streets, in ordinary buildings, by people with ordinary credentials who had made the decision, one step at a time, to do something that no credential and no title and no official signature could ever make acceptable. The Allied soldiers who liberated the camps and searched the tunnels and read the documents did not come home the same people who had left. Many of them spent the rest of their lives looking for words to describe what they had seen. Some never found the words and stopped trying. Some gave testimonies at trials and then returned to quiet lives, carrying the images with them privately. Some became advocates for historical education, traveling to schools and speaking to young people, because they believed, urgently and sincerely, that if enough people understood what had happened, perhaps it could never happen again. The Nuremberg trials, which began in 1945 and continued in various forms for several years, attempted to do something that had never really been done before in history, to hold the leaders of a government legally accountable for what that government had done. It was an imperfect process, shaped by the political realities of the moment. Not everyone who deserved to face judgment did. Some escaped. Some died before they could be brought to trial. Some were protected because of knowledge or skills that the victorious powers wanted to keep for themselves. But some did face trial. And they faced it in a courtroom in a damaged city, in a country that lay in ruins, surrounded by evidence of what had been done in the name of their ideology. The documents were there. The photographs were there. The survivors were there, their testimony careful and precise and devastating. The greatest and most persistent lesson that comes from studying what was discovered inside Nazi Germany is not about the uniqueness of that particular government or that particular moment in history. The lesson is actually a more uncomfortable one. It is the lesson that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, with ordinary jobs and ordinary families, are capable of participating in extraordinary cruelty when the systems around them make that cruelty feel normal, expected, or required. The people who designed the T4 program had been trained to save lives. The people who filed the Einsatzgruppen reports had been trained to follow procedure. The people who organized the train schedules and managed the warehouse inventories at Auschwitz had been trained to be efficient administrators. The people who built rockets in the tunnels had been trained as engineers. Each of them had applied their training, their discipline, and their professional skills to something that should have been refused at the very first request. None of what happened was truly hidden. The gates of Auschwitz bore a phrase that was a lie visible to anyone who chose to read it critically. The trains ran through towns where people lived, on schedules that neighbors could see. The smoke rose into the sky where anyone with eyes could observe it. The paperwork moved through offices staffed by human beings who could read. The most terrifying discovery of all, the one that the historians and investigators and survivors have been trying to communicate ever since, is perhaps this: the secrets of Nazi Germany were not hidden behind impenetrable walls. They were hidden in the place where the most dangerous secrets always hide. They were hidden in plain sight, protected not by locked doors but by the far more powerful barrier of people choosing, day after day, not to look.